It's often hard to think of how a place so naturally beautiful can be spoiled by the depravity of humans. I'm not talking about saving a rainforest or polluting the oceans, but tainting places on a smaller scale. Unfortunately, crime and seemingly senseless acts occur regularly everywhere, regardless of location, wealth, or time. It was once said that death is the great equalizer, the one big thing that can finally make strangers shed a tear for one another. Within the heart of these quaint and scenic Bavarian towns, about 43 miles north of Munich, the HINTERKAIFECK murders have become infamous as the scene of one of the most puzzling and gruesome crimes in German history. In the evening of March 31st, 1922, the 6 inhabitants of the farm were killed. The murders of the Gruber family remain unsolved. We do not know if Maria Baumgartner had heard the scandalous secrets that surrounded her new employers, like the thick pine trees that enclosed the HINTERKAIFECK homestead. The 44-year-old was mentally and physically disabled. She had never married, and since the death of her parents, had been forced to find work as a maid. But keeping work had not been easy. She had recently lost her job, allegedly because the mayor of the town had objected to a crippled person entering their community. Now Maria's sister Franziska had found her this job with the Gruber family. Whatever Maria did or did not know about her new employers, everyone else in the small town knew there was something deeply wrong and dark at the heart of the Gruber family. Their previous maid had fled 6 months earlier, claiming that ghosts were rattling around in the attic of the remote farmstead. But spirits in the timbers were the least of the Gruber family's problems. Cezilia Gruber, almost 10 years her husband's senior, would come to town covered in bruises, and only one of the couple's children had survived into adulthood. It was no secret that Andreas Gruber still beat his elderly wife. But that wasn't the reason why the 63-year-old man had served a prison sentence previously. In 1917, a court convicted Andreas of engaging in an incestuous relationship with his young adult daughter, Viktoria Gabriel, who had been previously widowed, losing her husband in World War I. With Andreas now out of jail, the whole family was back living together under the same roof. This all-in-the-family arrangement wouldn't have raised eyebrows if it wasn't for the fact that since her father's release from prison, Viktoria had given birth to a second child. The 35-year-old widow would not publicly reveal the identity of the child's father, but rumors were rife that there was a more than usually strong resemblance between the 2-year-old Joseph and his incestuous grandfather. Not that there were many options at Viktoria's disposal. She had returned to her parents' homestead in 1914 when her husband went off to war. That same year, her father made her the sole owner of the HINTERKAIFECK home, staying on as contractor. Then her husband, Karl Gabriel, had died in December, a victim of the trenches. Strangely, just 1 month after her husband's death, Viktoria gave birth to a daughter. Little Cezilia Gabriel was named for her grandmother. Despite the skeletons in this family's closet, they were still comfortably off. This was a household into which Maria Baumgartner entered on that Saturday, March 31st, 1922. By the following evening, she would be dead with the rest of the Gruber family. Kaifek was a small hamlet, densely shrouded by pines. These days, though, it has vanished utterly from the map, as it was incorporated into a municipality in 1971. Hinterkaifeck was even more remote, nothing but a tiny farmstead at the edge of the dark, snowy woods. So when Andreas Gruber had come into town some days earlier with a strange story about unsettling events up at the farm, his neighbors offered to loan him a rifle. According to Andreas, he had been out one morning and had seen fresh footsteps in the snow leading toward the property. This in itself was strange enough, given the remoteness of the farm. But what had so disturbed the farmer was that while the footsteps leading to the property were clearly visible, there were no footsteps leading back towards the forest. Whoever had come from the woods had evidently not gone back that way. Later, the family heard strange noises coming from the attic. Then a set of keys had gone missing. Finally, they found a newspaper on the porch that no one in the family subscribed to. Andreas searched his property, but found no trace of any intruder. Although he did see scratch marks around the lock of one of the outbuildings, as if someone had tried to break in. He declined to borrow a gun, and no one thought to alert the police. Out here in the middle of nowhere, people have their own way of dealing with things. Viktoria Gabriel had a beautiful singing voice. So when she did not attend church that first Sunday in April 1922, people noticed her absence from the choir. Then when 7-year-old Cezilia failed to appear at school the following day, neighbors became concerned. Smoke had been seen coming from the chimney of the farmhouse, and the family's livestock had been tended to in their fields, but no one had seen a single member of the Gruber household for several days. By Tuesday, neighbors went to investigate. What they found at the Hinterkaifeck farmstead was so truly horrific that the crime still resonates today as one of Germany's most shocking unsolved mysteries. Nobody knows exactly what happened that night, the 31st of March, 1922, at Hinterkaifeck. But almost 100 years ago, the only person who could have told that story has taken it to his grave. But investigators pieced together what they could from the crime scene. They found the first body in the bedroom. Poor disabled Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived at Hinterkaifeck just hours earlier, was dead in her bed. She had been sleeping when her attacker brutally bludgeoned her. Then he had covered up her corpse with bed sheets. 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel was in his crib in his mother's bedroom. His killer had struck him with blunt force to the head. Once the boy was dead, The intruder concealed the tiny corpse beneath one of Viktoria's dresses. The remaining members of the household were found in the barn. From the state of the crime scene, investigators surmised what had happened within. The intruder had emerged on the property at some point during the hours of darkness. He lured Andreas Gruber, his wife, the older Cezilia, and their daughter Viktoria, one by one, into the barn. The HINTERKAIFECK killer then used a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe, to hack each victim to death. Once he was through, he piled up their bodies and covered them with hay. Little Cezilia, Viktoria's 7-year-old daughter, was also found dead in the barn. The intruder attacked her with the mattock, but did not complete the job. Unlike the older victims, the child remained alive for some time in the barn, surrounded by the bodies of her murdered family. When investigators discovered the victims, they were horrified to find that as she lay dying, the younger Cezilia had torn out clumps of her own hair. It was a truly terrifying scene. As the body discovery in the barn continued, investigators began amassing a whole lot of evidence and questions that remained unanswered. In a horrifying Goldilocks-type twist, the murderer seems to have made himself right at home in the HINTERKAIFECK horror house. Neighbors had seen the smoke coming from the chimney in the days after the murders, and investigators found the remains of meals that the killer had prepared for himself in the house. The livestock tended to, the pet dog left off its chain. The brutality and senselessness of the massacre sent shockwaves into the local community and beyond. But although the police pursued several possible leads, no one ever stood trial for the shocking crime. And without any credible leads, some unorthodox solutions were suggested. Autopsies were performed at the crime scene location a day later, and the victims' heads were removed. The murdered family's skulls were sent to Munich in a last-ditch attempt to breathe new life into the investigation from beyond the grave. Clairvoyants then examined the skulls, but to no new insights or avail. Incidentally, all the skulls went missing and were never recovered. It is possible, though, that they were destroyed during an Allied bombing during World War II. Even though the clairvoyants didn't turn up any answers, others believe that the crimes were still carried out by a dead man. Viktoria's late husband Karl had been reported dead in World War I, but his body was never found. Some amateur sleuths suggest that Karl faked his own death and then returned to kill his former family out of revenge for the incest. However, there is no evidence that Karl survived the war, and several of his comrades report witnessing his death on the battlefield in 1914. It was sadly not uncommon for remains to go unidentified during World War I, with many war dead interred into mass graves. A more credible suspect was Lorentz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had been among the first to find the bodies. Although he was not named on the birth certificate, Viktoria had identified him as Joseph's father and had sued him for child support. In 1919, he had brought new allegations of incest against Viktoria's father, claiming that she had told him little Joseph was either his child or her father's. Schlittenbauer sued the family for slander until his death in 1941, persisting he was not the killer. Despite all this soap opera backstory, there was nothing of substance either linking Schlittenbauer to the atrocious crimes. There is also nothing in Schlittenbauer's background or subsequent life that would suggest he was capable of such sickening violence against an entire family. In 2007, students at a German police academy attempted to use modern forensic techniques to solve this crime. They eliminated all the prime suspects from the initial 1920s investigation, with their exception of one. But the students refused to publicly name their suspect out of respect for his living descendants. Another theory takes account of many eerily similar murders that happened in America. Speculation grew that there may be a possible link to a previously unidentified American serial murderer who had also never been caught. Paul Mueller was a German or Austrian immigrant to America who seems to have been responsible for a string of previously unsolved murders in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In these murders, entire households were killed with an axe or similar implement, after which the killer spent some time at the crime scene before moving on to the next town. He typically targeted households with a prepubescent daughter, as in the HINTERKAIFECK murders. The murderer at HINTERKAIFECK used the same modus operandi as the man from the train in the killings, and arranged the crime scene in the same ritualistic manner. Because the details of the American crimes were not reported internationally, the killer could not have been a copycat. But the similarities in the HINTERKAIFECK murders and the American crimes are so striking that they go far beyond coincidence. The string of axe murders in the United States abruptly ceased in 1912, leaving the authorities to speculate that the culprit either died, was imprisoned, or went elsewhere. Mueller was under suspicion by 1912, but vanished not long after. Given what happened at HINTERKAIFECK, it seems most likely that he returned to his homeland to escape capture. After lying low for a while, he resumed his murder spree in his usual style. Without the cold case investigators releasing absolute proof by naming their suspect publicly, we can only assume their suspicions lead to the elusive man from the train theory. The Gruber's maid, who quit 6 months prior, reported seeing the shadows of a man in the woods staring at the house. Later, the Grubers reported seeing him too. Had someone been watching them from the dark forest? Could the sounds in the attic have been the rustling of a stalker who bravely took up residence hiding in their home until he was confident enough to come down and kill them? Or was there some evil entity attached to the old farmhouse that may have been attracted by the spirit of incest and dysfunction in the family? The Gruber's bodies were buried in the nearby cemetery at Waidenhof without their heads. A year later, in 1923, the house and property were demolished as locals no longer wanted it around. Today, there is a shrine near the site of the former farmstead, where the victims will always be remembered. Incidentally, a large sum of cash was found in the Gruber home, so robbery was not a motive. But who was the Hinterkaifeck killer or killers? What's more, is what could the motive have been? Unfortunately, we will probably never know. The only one who may know was the man who left footprints in the snow.